The water is calm. The wooden hull of the fishing boat rocks gently against the shallows of the Galilee. Instead, he starts talking about dirt. He talks about a farmer throwing seeds on a hard path. Yeast is a corrupting agent. It spreads entirely unseen. It ferments the dough in the dark. He tells them the kingdom is like a wheat field where an enemy has planted weeds in the dead of night. The servants want to rip the weeds out immediately. They want to purify the field by force. But the master says no. Let them grow together until the harvest. The religious elite demand immediate purity. They want the sinners ripped out of the congregation. They want the tax collectors completely excised from the nation. They want a clean field right now. Jesus says the scythe does not belong to them. He is dismantling their entire worldview. Story by story, image by image, weed by weed. The kingdom he describes is small. The kingdom is hidden. The kingdom is subversive. The kingdom operates completely outside their jurisdiction. They cannot regulate the yeast in the dough. They cannot stop the invasive mustard plant. They cannot dictate the final harvest. The Pharisees hear the words. They feel the sting of the insult creeping in, even if they cannot fully articulate the theology behind it. But Jesus is not finished, because the stories are about to shift. He is about to move away from the dirt, away from the fields. He talks about weeds growing secretly in the middle of a wheat field. He tells a story about a woman hiding yeast, and into a territory that the religious establishment guards even more fiercely than their doctrine. He is about to talk about their money. You live in a world built entirely on the mechanics of transaction. Every hour of your day, every ounce of your energy, every swipe of a glass screen is carefully measured and traded for something else. You are taught from childhood to acquire, to hoard, to build a financial and emotional safety net thick enough that no tragedy can ever break through and touch you. If you are honest, you probably bring that exact same economic anxiety into your theology. You want to know what it costs. You want to know the minimum required investment to keep God happy, to secure your future, to make sure your spiritual accounts are perfectly balanced. The men standing on the shoreline built an entire religious empire on that anxiety. They viewed God as a divine ledger. Obey the law, receive the blessing, keep the rules, accumulate the spiritual wealth. They were spiritual accountants, meticulously tracking every tithe down to the last mint leaf in their herb gardens. But look at what Jesus does to their economy. He tells a story about a man walking through a dirt field who trips over a hidden treasure. He tells another about a merchant in 60 pounds of flour, and a merchant selling everything he owns for a single pearl. The crowd listens. The Pharisees listen, who has spent his entire life running his hands over fine jewels, only to suddenly find a single pearl of immense, incalculable value. Notice what happens in both stories. The men do not negotiate. They do not consult their ledgers. They do not ask for a layaway plan. The text says that in their overwhelming joy, they go and sell everything they own just to possess the one thing they found. They empty their houses. They liquidate their properties. They trade every last copper coin for the dirt and the pearl. The kingdom of heaven is not an addition to your life's portfolio. It is the liquidation of your entire estate. You cannot add this kingdom to your current set of priorities, hoping to balance it alongside your ambition, your comfort, and your pride. You cannot fit the pearl into a pocket that is already weighed down with cheaper, jagged stones. The transaction demands everything. Not because God is a tyrant demanding a tax, but because the reality being offered is so massive, so weighty, that it will fundamentally crush any other allegiance you try to hold alongside it. This is the economic subversion of the parables. It asks you to look at the cold, hard currency of your life, your time, your reputation, your carefully curated security, and recognize it. Even his own inner circle listens, and nobody understands a word. We know they do not understand, because later, as utterly bankrupt compared to the secret buried in the field. But this total surrender is not a punishment. The code of the parables is actually doing something deeply protective. Hiding the truth from the arrogant is not an act of spite. Jesus says something terrifying in the middle of Matthew chapter 13. Listen to the verse again. Jesus looks at the disciples in that dimly lit house, the oil lamp flickering on the packed clay floor, and he draws a definitive line between them and the crowd outside. To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. It sounds exclusive. It sounds like a heavy iron gate pulling shut. But the word Matthew uses here changes the entire landscape of what is happening. The English text translates it as secrets or mysteries. The Greek word is mysterion. It comes from the ancient root verb myo, which literally means to close the mouth or to shut the eyes. In the ancient world, it did not mean a murder mystery. You could figure out if you just had enough clues. It meant a truth that was entirely inaccessible to human logic. It meant a reality that could only be known if God actively ripped the veil in two and showed it to you, when they are finally alone in a quiet house. The disciples pull him aside and ask the question that is hanging over. Paul uses this exact same word years later. He writes from a damp Roman prison, chains rattling against stone, to tell the Ephesians that the ancient wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles has been shattered. He calls it a mysterion. A mysterion is a truth so blindingly bright it will destroy you if you are not prepared to see it. That changes everything. When Jesus speaks in parables, he is not withholding the truth to punish the religious elite. He is withholding the truth to protect them. The parables are not a barricade. They are a shield. To see the Son of God with perfect clarity, to fully recognize the blinding truth of who he is, and to reject him to his face is a line of no return. If the Pharisees hear the raw, unfiltered truth of the kingdom, and they reject it with full understanding, there is no more grace left in the cup. Their condemnation is permanently sealed. If he speaks plainly, their pride forces them to condemn him immediately. If he speaks in parables, their pride simply makes them ignore him. He wraps the blinding light of heaven in the dirty burlap of a farmer's sack. He hides the thundering voice of God inside the tiny, silent shell of a mustard seed. He takes the absolute dismantling of the temple economy and folds it into a story about a woman baking bread. The entire text of Matthew chapter 13. Why do you speak to the people in parables? Why the sudden change in tactics? He gives them space. He drops a puzzle into their minds. He lets them walk away with a riddle instead of a death sentence. The code gives them time to let their arrogant walls fall down. It gives the seed time to wait in the dark, but a seed cannot stay in the dark forever. Eventually, the sun comes up, and eventually, the men in power finally figure out what the stories actually mean. The days pass. The crowds swell. The heat of the Judean sun bakes the massive white stones of the temple courtyard. Jesus is no longer sitting in a boat on the gentle waves of the Galilee. He is standing in Jerusalem. He is standing on the polished floors of their theological empire. The scribes surround him. The Pharisees tighten the circle. The temple guards grip the heavy wooden shafts of their spears. They demand his authority. They demand straight answers. He does not give them a straight answer. He gives them another story. He talks about a master who plants a vineyard. The master builds a wall. He digs a wine press. He leases the land to tenants and travels to a far country. Harvest time comes. The master sends servants to collect the fruit. The tenants beat one. They stone another. They kill a third. Why are you burying the message in riddles about weeds and seeds? Most people assume they already know the answer. Finally, the master sends his own son. The tenants see the heir. They grab him. They drag him out of the vineyard. They murder him in the dust. And in that exact moment, the mirror shatters. Matthew chapter 21 records the shift. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. The puzzle clicks. The lock turns. The blindfold falls. They look at the carpenter from Nazareth. They look at the story of the murdered son. They realize they are the wicked tenants standing in the vineyard. The story is not an agricultural metaphor. It is an arrest warrant. They do not repent. They do not drop to their knees on the pavement. They do not tear their robes in sorrow. They immediately look for a way to kill him. The weapon worked perfectly. The mashal bypassed their intellectual defenses. It slipped past their religious arrogance. It landed dead center in their conscience. For months, he protected them with riddles. He shielded them from the blinding light of the kingdom. He gave them a window of grace disguised as stories about seeds and coins. But the window just closed. The collision is now inevitable. The machine wakes up. They will pay 30 pieces of silver. We are told in Sunday school that Jesus used parables because they were simple, earthly stories with heavenly meanings. They will find a traitor in the dark. They will drag the storyteller to a Roman courtyard. They will listen to the dull, metallic ring of a heavy hammer driving iron through human flesh. They kill him because he told them a story they could not control. But the parables did not die in that courtyard. They survived the first century. They outlived the Roman Empire. They outlasted the Pharisees. And the terrifying reality is that the stories are still doing their exact sorting work right now. We hold these texts today, enclosed in heavy leather covers and printed on razor-thin paper with gold leaf edges, assuming that the distance of 2,000 years has somehow neutralized their threat. We buy them in quiet bookstores. We highlight the verses in bright yellow ink. We paint the stories of the seeds and the lost sheep on the walls of children's nurseries, fully convinced that we have domesticated the weapon. We treat the parables like antique artifacts beautiful to look at, completely harmless, and firmly under our control. But the text has not changed. The mashal has not lost a single ounce of its edge. The riddles Jesus threw into the crowded shores of the Galilee are still doing exactly what he designed them to do. We assume he used agricultural metaphors to make complex theology accessible to uneducated peasants. We think he is just being folksy. They are actively, continuously sorting the human heart. When we read the story of the unforgiving servant choking his debtor, or the rich fool tearing down his barns to build bigger ones, or the older brother standing furiously outside a party, because grace was given to a rebel, we are not reading a passive historical document. The document is reading us. We still approach the divine with our spiritual ledgers, meticulously tracking our morality and our good behavior, expecting a fair return on our religious investment. We still want a God who speaks in clear, manageable checklists that leave our pride perfectly intact. We still prefer a system of worship that operates like a predictable, balanced transaction, rather than a tiny, invisible seed that violently uproots the soil of our ambition. The parables are not safe historical fables. They are active spiritual tripwires. They are sitting quietly in the pages of the New Testament, waiting to see if we will approach them with the arrogant certainty of a Pharisee or the desperate hunger of a beggar. If we read them with pride, assuming we already know the answer, the lock engages. The stories will bounce harmlessly, but if you look closer at the Greek and Hebrew words hiding beneath the text, at the exact moment in the timeline, off the hardened paths of our minds, sounding like nothing more than ancient agricultural advice, the mirror will reflect nothing but our own intellect. But if we let our defenses fall, the code begins to break open. If we allow the uncomfortable truth of the mysterion to sink into the dark, hidden places of our lives, the yeast begins to work its way through the dough of our carefully managed empires. The seed breaks its shell in the dark. The parables still demand a total liquidation. They still require us to look at the massive, unwieldy reality of the kingdom and trade everything we have ever valued just to hold the pearl in our hands. And when you step back from the individual riddles and look at the entire landscape of these weaponized stories, you realize they were never just random lessons scattered across the hillsides of Judea. They were all pointing toward the exact same ending. A farmer scatters seed on hard dirt, and the condition of the soil determines the harvest. A woman hides yeast in 60 pounds of flour, and an entire empire is subverted in the dark. The sand is packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, with a desperate, breathless crowd. You can see fishermen with calloused hands when he starts doing this. At the violent, murderous reaction these stories eventually provoke, you start to see something. A merchant finds a single pearl and liquidates his entire life just to hold it in his hands. A king forgives an impossible debt and exposes the violent arrogance of the servant who will not do the same. A shepherd walks away from 99 sheep and refuses to rest until the lost one is carried home. A rebel son squanders his inheritance in the mud, and a father runs down a dirt road to throw a robe over his shame. A master sends his only son to a hostile vineyard, and the blood spilled in the dust shatters the mirror forever. One voice, one code, one kingdom. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the mustard seed. Not a majestic cedar of Lebanon, not a towering oak of righteousness. The invasive, unruly weed that the Pharisees literally outlawed in their manicured gardens. The tiny, silent shell that refuses to play by the rules of a massive, gold-plated temple economy. It asks for nothing but dirt, and yet it quietly pushes its roots through the perfectly orderly rows of our religious ambition, taking over everything. If you are in a season where the kingdom of heaven feels impossibly small, the simple story reading completely misses. The parables are not illustrations meant to clarify. They are locks meant to conceal. Or if you are exhausted by a religious system that demands you bring a perfectly balanced ledger to the altar, John chapter 12 is a place to sit. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. The Mysterion does not ask you to conquer the field. It asks you to surrender to the dark. It asks you to stop trying to intellectually decode the riddles and simply let the seed do its violent, beautiful work in the quiet. If this shattered a mirror for you today, subscribe, leave a comment. Even one word helps. Share this with someone who is tired of the spiritual ledgers. Pray for us as we keep digging into these ancient texts. And may the God who has hidden the universe inside a single, buried seed meet you in your own quiet darkness and grow something inside of you that can never be tamed. He is not making it easier for the religious elite to understand. He is actively, intentionally making it harder. The question is why? And the answer changes how you read every single coded story he left behind. To find the answer, you cannot just look at the stories themselves. You have to look at what happened exactly. One chapter before he got into the boat. You have to watch the religious leaders cross a line that could never be uncrossed. In the Gospel of Matthew, there is a clear, structural fracture. It happens in chapter 12. Right before the shift to the boats and the seeds, a man possessed, blind and mute, is healed. The crowd leans in, wondering if this is the son of David. But the Pharisees, with their vast theological training, look at the exact same miracle and declare that the power flowing through Jesus comes directly from the Lord of the Flies. Beelzebul. This is the line. This is the official, calculated rejection by the religious establishment. They have seen the light, and they have called it darkness. You can smell the copper and sweat of tax collectors. You can hear the low murmurs of women holding restless toddlers. If you are a rabbi, and the men who control the synagogues, the temple guards, and the courts have just accused you of demonic sorcery, you have a tactical problem. If you continue to preach the raw, unfiltered theology of the kingdom, if you keep saying outright that their religious system is dead and a new kingdom is crashing into the earth, they will not just argue with you. They will pick up stones. They will arrest you before the work is finished. The parables are not a retreat. They are a tactical maneuver. Jesus needed a way to speak treason against the religious establishment while standing right in front of them. He needed a language that would sound completely harmless to a prideful scribe, but explosive to a hungry fisherman. He needed a Trojan horse. Think about how a parable functions in the mind of an arrogant man. When Jesus talks about a farmer scattering seed, the Pharisee immediately tunes it out. To the educated elite, agriculture is beneath them. It is the language of the dirt, the language of the unwashed masses, the language of calluses and sweat. They hear a story about wheat and weeds, and they assume the radical rabbi has lost his edge and resorted to nursery rhymes. They lower their weapons. They stop looking for heresy because they are too busy being bored. When you tell a proud man a riddle he thinks is a child's story, and standing at the edges of the shoreline with arms folded, robes pristine, and eyes narrowed, are the men from the capital. He does not ask for the interpretation. His pride prevents him from admitting he does not understand. And so, the mystery remains sealed. They do not realize that the story they just dismissed is a bomb sitting in the center of their theology, waiting to detonate. They feel the smooth, polished wood of the temple benches. They smell the sweet, heavy incense of their own piety. They hear a story about a mustard seed, and they walk away, completely unaware that the kingdom of heaven just bypassed their intellectual defenses entirely. The stories are not windows. They are mirrors. They are designed to reflect the exact spiritual condition of the person listening. To the hungry, the story opens up the universe. To the arrogant, it sounds like absolute nonsense. And the moment Jesus steps off that boat, the parables begin to do their sorting work. But the true genius of the code is not just in how it hides the truth from the powerful. It is in what happens to the secret once it is buried in the dark soil of a peasant's mind. The crowds scatter. The Pharisees retreat. The sun drops below the hills. Jesus walks into a house, and a heavy wooden door pulls shut behind him. The heat of the day lingers in the mud brick walls. You can smell the sweat and dust baked into their robes. The scribes, the Pharisees, the religious elite who have walked for days just to find a reason to kill him. You can hear the low, hushed tones of a secret meeting. The disciples are exhausted. Their feet ache. Their minds are spinning. They just watched their rabbi look thousands of desperate, oppressed people in the eye and give them nothing but agricultural advice. Peter leans in. John waits. The men who left their nets want a revolution. They want fire from heaven. They want the Romans driven into the sea. And instead, they get a story about a farmer. They corner him. They demand the key. Why speak to them like this? Jesus answers by explaining the dirt. He breaks the code. The hard path is a hardened heart. The birds are the enemy snatching the truth. The rocks are the heat of persecution. The thorns are the suffocating, twisting vines of wealth and worry. The good soil is the heart that hears, absorbs, and holds on. 4 soils, 4 responses. 1 seed? Look at the mechanics of what he is describing. Look at how the system actually operates. A seed does not explode. A seed does not conquer with force. A seed goes into the dark. It gets buried. It waits. It breaks open in secret, entirely out of sight. The kingdom of heaven is not a military campaign. It is an underground resistance. This is what the disciples are struggling to understand in the flickering lamplight. Up until this exact afternoon, the rabbi from Nazareth has been perfectly clear. He has spoken in direct, terrifyingly blunt commands. Rome marches with iron and noise. The kingdom grows in silence. Caesar conquers with swords. The kingdom plants with words. The Pharisees build massive theological walls. The kingdom buries tiny, invisible seeds. Jesus is telling them that the truth will not be forced on anyone. If a heart is hard, the story will bounce right off. If a heart is crowded with ambition, the story will be choked to death. The parable requires participation. It demands surrender. It refuses to do the work for you. But to really grasp the violence of what Jesus is doing, in this room, you have to look at the exact word the disciples use when they confront him. They do not ask him why he tells stories. They do not ask him why he uses illustrations. They ask him something entirely different, using a word that changes the shape of every riddle he ever told. When you read Matthew chapter 13 inches English, the disciples ask a simple question. Why do you speak to the people in parables? We hear the word parable today, and our modern minds immediately jump to Aesop's fables. We think of a children's story, a moral tale with a neat, digestible lesson at the end. We assume the disciples are asking why Jesus is using such a folksy, accessible teaching method. But the word Matthew writes in the Greek text is parable. It is a compound word, para meaning alongside, and balo meaning to cast or to throw. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Love your enemies. Do not worry about tomorrow. When he preached on the mountain, the theology was laid bare, literally, to cast alongside. It is the act of throwing two disparate things next to each other, so the listener is forced to grapple with the comparison. But behind the Greek parable sits an older, sharper, more dangerous Hebrew concept. The word Jesus and his disciples would have known intimately is the Hebrew word mashal. If something about the original language of this text is stirring up questions you have never considered, you are exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe. Because every week we go deeper into the text than you knew was possible. So, a mashal is not a bedtime story. In the ancient Near East, a mashal could be a proverb, a taunt, a prophetic oracle, or a dark riddle. It was an intellectual puzzle designed to tease the mind into active, uncomfortable thought. It was not a pill you could swallow easily. It was a knot you had to untie with your teeth. We see this exact tactic used hundreds of years earlier in the Old Testament, when the prophet Nathan needs to confront King David about a stolen wife and a murdered soldier. He does not walk into the palace with a list of theological accusations. If he had, the king's guards would have killed him before his knees hit the cold stone floor. Instead, Nathan walks in and tells a mashal. He tells a story about a rich man who steals a poor man's single, beloved lamb. The demands were unmistakable. You did not have to guess what he meant. But today, the wind shifts. David hears the story, feels the injustice of it, and pronounces a death sentence on the rich man. And then the trap snaps shut. Nathan looks at the king and says, "You are the man." That root changes everything. When Jesus throws a parable into a crowd on the shoreline, he is doing exactly what Nathan did in the throne room. He is handing his listeners an ideological puzzle that requires them to condemn themselves before they even realize what is happening. A parable is not an illustration meant to make theology easy. It is a linguistic weapon designed to slip past your defenses. It smuggles the truth across enemy lines, disguised as a story about seeds or coins, waiting for the exact right moment to detonate in the listener's conscience. But a weapon is only effective if it is aimed at the right target. And the next stories Jesus tells from that boat are aimed directly at the foundation of the religious elite's entire empire. Jesus does not stop with the dirt. He leans over the wooden edge of the boat. The salt air bites at the crowd. He throws another story. Then another. Then another. He talks about a mustard seed. He talks about weeds in a wheat field. He talks about a woman baking bread. He talks about a dragnet pulling fish from the dark water. Today, he sits in the boat, looks at the hungry faces on the shoreline, and he stops giving them straightforward answers. To the exhausted fishermen, it sounds like their everyday lives. To the women holding toddlers on their hips, it sounds like their kitchens. But to the scribes standing stiffly on the shoreline, the comparisons are quietly, deeply offensive. Look at the contrast. Look at what the elite value versus the images he chooses. The Pharisees operate an empire of massive proportions. Their temple is built of blinding white stone and heavy gold. It smells of roasted meat, burnt offerings, and expensive incense. It is loud. It is public. It is heavily regulated by priests holding long lists of rules. But Jesus looks at the crowd and says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed." A mustard seed is not a symbol of grand, majestic beginnings. It is the image of a hostile takeover. In the first century world, mustard was an invasive plant. Rabbinic law actually forbade planting it in a manicured garden because its roots would take over everything. It grows wildly. It spreads aggressively. It cannot be tamed. It disrupts the neat, perfectly orderly rows of the established religious system. He tells them the kingdom is like a woman hiding yeast in 60 pounds of flour.